Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin our discussion, the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School, the host of today's event, would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We'll dedicate 15 to 20 minutes of our time together to respond to your questions. Thank you to those of you who've sent them in. We encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A box that will send them to us. The panelists and I will see it. We also want to take this opportunity to let the Harvard community members know that the Harvard's Vote Challenge, a nonpartisan initiative striving to build a culture here at Harvard, by increasing voter registration and participation among the entire community. We invite all participants to join the movement at voteschallenge.harvard.edu. Finally, this event is being recorded and can be found on the Ash Center website and YouTube channel as soon as the event has concluded. My name is Abby Kisa, and I'm the Director of Impact at a research center called Circle. Circle is based at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University, and we've been looking at and trying to help increase, diversify, and sustain young people's influence and participation on elections for 20 years. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with our experts today. And to start the conversation, I want to share a little bit of data with you based on what we've collected so far this year in 2020 and what we found in previous years. Our theme today is young people's influence on elections. And to talk about that, we really need to look back at the last presidential election and see, as you can see here in this graph, that young people influence elections regardless of their turnout. We see states on here where youth voter turnout, the number of youth votes cast, far exceed the margin of victory. We should also talk about the fact that more context for 2020 is the truly epic year that we saw in 2018, where youth voter turnout doubled nationally, increased in every state for which we have data, and was higher amongst this first group of members of Gen Z in the 2018 midterm election than any other turnout in midterm elections since the 26th Amendment was passed, lowering the voting age to 18. We saw youth voter turnout increase in 31 states by double digits and in 5 states by more than 20 percentage points, which is particularly profound in a midterm election. More context to this election in 2020 is the amount of leadership that young people have taken, especially young women and especially young women of color, to do work of mobilizing other young people to participate in movements and to vote. But even though there was such profound turnout in 2018, which we can increase because some young people were under-mobilized. Some young people face more barriers. Some young people have less systemic access. So in today's panel, I really want to bring to the conversation who's systemically left out and what's happening with that in 2020 during a pandemic. One of the things that we're seeing in 2020 is that young people believe in their own power. We're also seeing that the pandemic has helped many young people, almost 4 in 5, say that the decisions made by elected officials impact their everyday life. And that's a lesson that they've learned over the past several months while we've been going through this. We've also seen that youth engagement in politics has increased substantially from 2018. As you can see here, there's more young people 18 to 24 working to convince other young people to vote, working on and donating to campaigns, and attending marches and demonstrations. Most of these numbers have also increased substantially since 2016 when we collected them for the first time. We are also seeing substantial rises in youth voter registration in many states compared to early November of 2016. But of course, this is all in the context of a global pandemic and new barriers to potentially youth voter turnout or layered onto the existing barriers. So that's a little bit of context. And to jump directly into 2020 and the heart of our conversation, I'm going to turn it over to Justin Tseng to talk about the recent data collected by students and the polling project at the Harvard Institute of Politics.
Thank you, Abby, for such a great rundown of what is happening in our nation today. I just wanted to first quickly introduce the Harvard Public Opinion Project. Our group was started 20 years ago to study why it seems that young people were less engaged in politics. And what we actually found was young people are engaged in civics and are engaged in politics, but they just find their impact in different ways. And when it comes to voting, they're much more likely to vote when they think that they have the power to change the system, and when they have the power to shape policies. And that sentiment hasn't always been true, but I think we see that now. We've seen that in 2018, and we've seen that this year in 2020. I wanted to share a few key takeaways regarding this election with our last poll finding in September. There were basically, regarding the election, there's three big takeaways that I want us to keep in mind. So the first takeaway is that enthusiasm for voting is way up. 63% of our respondents indicated that they would definitely be voting. And this is compared to 47% 4 years ago. Now, this is an increase of about I can't do math. 16% ish. And we actually find that this election might be more comparable to the 2008 election, where a similar percentage of respondents indicated that they would definitely be voting. 2008 was actually the election that saw the highest youth turnout since 1984, which is the earliest census reporting of turnout that we have, which indicates that this is going to be a youth-driven election. Another key finding that we found was that the issues that young people are paying attention to have shifted dramatically since last year and since the spring. So what we've found for most of the Trump years is that young voters have been focused on issues of healthcare and education and mental health. And while those issues are still similarly very important today, there's been a very last minute change towards the economy, where young people are really facing the brunt of the economic consequences of COVID-19. And that is really top of mind for a lot of young people today. And the next kind of most important issue for young people is the pandemic itself. Again, the last time we saw this kind of last minute change towards the economy was 2008. Which is an interesting kind of similarity between these two elections. The last takeaway that we found in our September survey was that young people are a lot more likely to favor Joe Biden over Donald Trump. Now, I think, again, going back to 2008, we saw this huge youth turnout for Barack Obama. In that election, in our survey, Barack Obama led by about 29 points. Now we see that Joe Biden is leading by about 33 points among likely voters. So this is a huge gap that that Republicans should be aware of. But we also found that young Americans who support Trump are far more enthusiastic about their support. About 44% of young Trump voters are very enthusiastic about voting for President Trump, whereas only 30% of young Biden voters are very enthusiastic about voting for him. But despite this, enthusiasm for these two nominees are up compared to in 2016. Both parties' voting bases are more enthusiastic about their nominees, and likely Biden voters are actually more, Biden supporters are more likely to turn out at the polls. And we were digging into this, but we anecdotally are pretty sure this is related to President Trump and young voters' disapproval of the president, and how this has driven activism and turnout, especially on the left.
Thank you so much, Justin. Incredible data in an incredible youth-driven election cycle. I want to get back to that. So for more data and the details on the survey that Justin just talked about, go to iop.harvard.edu. We also have 3 other amazing panelists joining us to dig deeper into these and other findings and share some of what they're seeing this fall. In a moment, each of them are going to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their recent work and how they think young people are going to impact the 2020 elections. Before we do that, I want to introduce them really briefly. First, we have Dawn Boudwin, who serves as the Deputy Executive Director of Network Strategy at the Alliance for Youth Organizing and is also a very proud auntie like I am. Second, Dakota Hall is the Executive Director of Leaders Igniting Transformation, focused on young people of color in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. As you just met, Justin Seng is the chair of the Harvard Opinion Project, an undergrad at Harvard. And finally, Dr. Michael Hanmer is professor of the University of Maryland Department of Government and Politics and research director at the UMD Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. Go Terps. So I'm going to turn it over to Dawn to tell us a little bit more about the Alliance and what you're seeing this year indicating youth influence so far.
Hi, Abby. Good to be back on a panel with you. I feel like we just did this, but good to see you again. And also a special thanks to the Ash Center for having me here today. As Abby mentioned, I'm the Deputy Executive Director of Network Strategy at the Alliance for Youth Organizing. And the Alliance, in a nutshell, is a network of young people-led organizations that focus on registering young people to vote, engaging them on the issues that they care about, activating them in their communities, and then ultimately turning them out to vote. Abby, I know you asked me this question to give a little bit of insight around what this means for 2020, but I'm very fortunate to be on this panel with one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, and who also just happens to be an executive director of one of our affiliate organizations. So I'm going to let him get into the nitty gritty of what this work looks like on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, I just want to say thanks again for having me and excited to get into the conversation.
All right, Dakota, you've been called out. Tell us a little bit more about LIT and what you're seeing so far this year.
Yeah, good afternoon, depending on where you are, or good morning to where you are. First things first, the Wisconsin badges will always be the Tar Heels, first and foremost. Let's just get that out the way in terms of anything out here. So as Don said, I'm the executive director of Leaders Igniting Transformation. We're based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we do work throughout all of Wisconsin. This has definitely been one of the more chaotic years of my life, and right now, like what's happening on the ground, I think is a bunch of excitement for this election. I think folks are feeling anxious, but also excited to do some amazing work. You know, we're 3 weeks away from Election Day, but many people, including myself, have already received their ballot. And so it's game time right now, and folks are excited to get their ballot back, turn their ballot in. Even here at LIT, we're doing a few things with staff who have received their ballot, and we'll be doing like videos and TikToks and all this other kind of stuff to help, build up some excitement about going to return your ballot at a drop box or in the mail, going to go vote, or all these other things going on as well too.
Thank you so much, Dakota. Dr. Hanmer, briefly, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing this year, especially in some of the recent research that you've been doing into, potential challenges.
Sure. So thanks for having me. Thanks to the Ash Center for inviting me. This is a great event. So I'm really excited to be here. I got my start in studying youth engagement with some help from Circle, a grant, and a partnership with Harvard's IOP. So this is kind of full circle, no pun intended there, for me. And something I've been very interested in. I think this election year is gonna bring a lot of confusion to people, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think that youth turnout is really going to be through the roof this time. I think we've seen this trending up. My biggest concern is that with anything that's relatively new, there's potential for mistakes. So with so many people that are going to be voting for the first time, and particularly voting by mail for the first time, I think we just need to be careful. I think events like this and all the great work that organizations are doing on the ground to provide information is crucial. I've seen some of this information also coming from the states, but not as much as I honestly would have expected. And I think that's something to watch out for as we get closer to the election. Our state's going to be more engaged getting information out about the process and providing help to people.
Thank you so much. Justin, we are talking, we're in a conversation where, the Ash Center, framed this conversation as, will young people with a question mark. And you're going beyond that and you're saying that this is going to be a youth-driven election. Not only are young people going to influence it, they're going to drive it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that and maybe some of the data behind that?
Yeah. So again, this kind of goes back to our comparisons, our cross-time comparisons with our polls in the past. And while the reported turnout that we ask, or the likely voting number that we see in our survey doesn't always come to fruition, there's actually quite constant gap between what actual turnout is and what our reported numbers are. So when we see that our turnout or the number of respondents saying that they are likely voters, when we see that number go up, we also tend to see turnout go up by the same percentage as well. So what we're seeing is that there is actually a very strong kind of connection there. And it is interesting that that the Ash Center did frame it as a question. And I think, seeing how young people have turned out in the past, it is fair to ask this question. But I think what we are seeing on the ground and what we're seeing in our data is that young people are going to turn out. And so I believe turnout last time with young people was actually pretty low for a presidential election. But I think what we're seeing now is young people have a reason to turn out. And in 2008, young people turned out for a candidate they really liked. I think what you're seeing now is they're turning out because they're anxious and they're worried about their future. And we're getting our poll results back for our October survey. And I would encourage everyone to kind of stay tuned for that, because we have actually kind of these explainers coming out very soon.
That's exciting. So speaking of what's happening on the ground, Dakota, Wisconsin is the #1 state on Tisch College's ranking of places where young people are most likely to have an impact on the presidential election outcomes. Can you tell us a few things about what you see happening in the state that make you believe that young folks of color are affecting this election there?
Yeah, I mean, they're registering at high numbers. They're turning out to events, whether they're virtual, in person, safely being done. And young people were the people starting back in May who in almost every place in Wisconsin took over the streets, right, and demanded accountability around racial equity, police accountability. And they're taking that energy and they're putting it into the electoral system at this moment, right? And I think while we all understand that candidates can definitely be moved on issues, young people understand that this is a moment in which will determine their lives, especially for young people of color, and making sure that they're doing everything they can to educate themselves on where candidates stand and then to push candidates on these issues. And so I think, it's been a long time coming that Wisconsin is always going to be the battleground state, and where and it's going to come down to margins like we saw probably in 2016, where 23,000 votes or something, right? That is more than made up by young people of color, right? When you think about the number of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx youth, if they come out and they vote, we're probably gonna see some really big changes in Wisconsin, up and down the state, right? Not just in centers like Milwaukee, but even Indigenous youth around the state are getting more involved in registering on their reservations, as well as doing the relational organizing with their uncles and their moms and everything like that as well too. So I think it's not just their vote, that they're impacting other votes by talking about these social issues.
Thanks so much, Dakota. And Wisconsin, has a unique voter registration system, but in some states, actually, their deadlines have passed already. And as days go by, we see more, and though not in all states. And, we're kind of moving into the moment where mobilization and GOTV are the game. So even though we're seeing high reg numbers in 2016, in 2020, then in most states in 2016, though not all, I'm wondering, Dawn, if this high registration is a positive indicator to you, or do you see more challenges to young folks casting a ballot once they're registered?
Ooh, that's a good question, Abby. I think that it's a little bit of a loaded question as well. But I think what I'll say to start is that the high registration numbers are definitely a positive indicator, right? Like, you can't play in the game if you're not on the roster. So like, that's the first step. But I think once folks are on the roles, it's important to make sure that we think through the steps that need to happen subsequently, right? So one of the necessary steps after getting registered is to make sure that young people are informed. So we often hear in conversations we have with young people that if they didn't vote in a previous election, it was because I didn't feel like I had enough information. And so it's both about supporting them with the information around who supports the policies and or is good on the issues that they care about, but also just how to actually participate, right? How to actually vote, the mechanics of voting. And I think even more so this year, as you mentioned before, we're in the midst of a pandemic and each state has its own laws. The laws are changing rapidly as we figure out how to make this work for COVID. So actually just providing young people with the information they need to actually be able to cast a ballot is half the battle. And then I think the last thing that also has to happen is actually investing in turning them out, right? So we have crews on the ground that are running large scale voter education programs and GOTV programs such as Dakota, where they're out there they're calling folks, they're texting folks, they're sending them mail, they're doing digital organizing, they're doing relational organizing, and all these different techniques to make sure that young people are able to turn out this election. I think it's really important to say that because what we often hear is like young people don't turn out, and then it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're not being invested in at the same rate as like other generations, say boomers, for example. I think I have a really good example. I was just at home this past weekend visiting my mom, and when I was with her, she got a phone call, she got multiple pieces of mail, she was getting texts, and then let's talk about how much outreach that I've received. I've gotten no text, which seems odd. I think I've received one piece of mail through this whole cycle. So like just that different level of investment actually really plays a role in how folks are able and will turn out. So I think the investing piece is key. And that's why I'm really fortunate to work in a network like ours, where folks are on the ground 365 organizing to make sure that the young folks are registered, informed, and are turning out.
Absolutely. So potentially influence is depending not only on access, but also investment in you having access. Dr. Hanmar, one of the things that I understand you've been doing is studying kind of different attitudes about voting methods. You raised the kind of flag a little bit about worrying that people are getting enough information right now. Is it your sense that people are open to lots of different voting methods and are, prepared to do what they need to do this year?
So I think there's good news and bad news. So we've done some survey work with the Washington Post, and this is pretty consistent across other surveys I've seen too, that you can get a majority of people will say that they feel confident that their vote will be accurately recorded regardless of voting method. But there are huge gaps based on which voting method. You get close to 90% on election day, drops a little bit for early in person, and then it goes down to 65% for voting by mail. And that's where you start to see partisan differences too. Democrats are much more confident than Republicans when it comes to voting by mail. And one of the things that's really interesting and I think should give us pause is that this issue was not a partisan issue until very recently. I've done some research looking at which states adopt various voting laws and why. And when no excuse absentee voting, started to take hold, that just wasn't a partisan issue. It was really put into place for more access in all sorts of states. Voter ID law is very different. Obviously, we know a lot about that more recent history. But that was somewhat of a surprising result at the time, especially now that we see so much of the rhetoric around voting by mail take this partisan tilt. And again, that's going back to my earlier comment. I just really think more and more information is better. And I think it's to pick up on Dawn's point and Dakota's as well. Young people getting out there and mobilizing each other is a great solution, because the parties and the campaigns haven't done a lot of that themselves. And so I think that's very encouraging to see.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hanmer. And so picking up on some of those points, Justin, did the recent poll that y'all did, I mean, are you seeing anything about, how much young people are maybe using digital to reach other young people, or in some of the challenges that Dr. Hanmer is talking about?
So our September survey doesn't really cover this, but giving a sneak peek into what we might find in this month without giving too much away, we definitely find that there are different ways of organizing, and that young people have different opinions of these very different ways. But what we've seen in the past as well that carries on into today is the idea that one of the most effective things that you can do to organize and to create political change is actually just to talk to your friends and family. And this, I think there's a lot being said about our generation, that we are engaged in armchair activism, that most of us just post retweets and like stories on Instagram or TikToks about these issues. But in some way, I think that ties to this larger belief that we can change politics if we talk to other people. And I think that's something that people don't talk about enough when it comes to young voters.
Right, which is something that Dakota brought up earlier, and not just talking to friends, but talking to family members. So Dakota, I want to come back to thinking about Wisconsin. So my understanding is that y'all work with both high school students and college students, like youth across the board. And some people might find this overwhelming for an organization, including because some high schoolers, aren't old enough to vote. But why is that model important to LIT?
Yeah, one of the reasons that we invest so heavily into our high school organizing department is the long-term game of our organizing, is to build like another wave of community organizers, to build activists, and also hopefully build lifetime voters, and understanding that it's going to take a cultural and behavioral thing, right? If they're not being taught that they need to be civically engaged inside of schools, I think that's where LIT comes into play, and helping them understand what organizing is, and showing them how they can impact their school. In our high school department, they work a lot on the school to prison pipeline and the environments in which schools are being taught, everything down to school lunches to the way in which they are able to enter their schools. And our high school team has done an amazing job of integrating civic engagement into that, and telling them about the school board, and having them show up to school board meetings. And at the really, like, one of the basic levels of government, having high school students really dictate what needs to happen inside of schools. Our high school team has been able to successfully remove school resource officers. They've been able to block contracts to add additional metal detectors and facial recognition software. They've put forth plans that got passed around investing into Black Lives Matter education, Indigenous education. For the first time in our school district's history, we recognized Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday, and that was directly due to our high school team doing that advocacy and working with high school students. And that hopefully is going to lead to them, the high school students specifically, being civically engaged in college, and then after college, and just continuing to understand that they actually do have power in this country.
Thanks so much, Dakota. One of the things, in my experience, I guess I should say, is that a lot of conversations about young voters deal in stereotypes of who young people are. But in reality, these 49 million young folks have a great deal of diversity even within the generation. So I'm wondering, how, when you're thinking about your work, Dawn, across this huge network that y'all have at the Alliance, how are you thinking about reaching, young people who maybe haven't been reached before, right? especially, in our data, usually the folks with the least amount of contact are the low income Black and Brown communities, young folks from there. And what have y'all seen be successful in the Alliance Network and reaching those young folks?
Yeah, I think one thing is acknowledging that young people aren't just on college campuses. I think that you're going to get some young people there, but that's not where they exclusively are. And college isn't or like traditional four-year colleges. So we have young people that go to community college. We have young people that are not going to college at all and are just like in their community. So I think some of the things that we've seen that have been really successful in reaching those folks are really actually doing community organizing. So not just campus organizing, our groups also focus on community organizing, where they go out in surrounding communities of campuses or in local communities that are highly populated with young people and go have conversations right at their doors. Clearly that's different during times of COVID, but that is something that generally happens when things are not in the midst of a pandemic. Also, I think to what Dakota is talking about is this level of relational organizing, right? As groups have volunteers, they have their volunteers reach out to 10 people that they know and talk about the election and get them involved. Then they have those folks reach out to 10 more people. So then you have like this network of folks that are all talking about these things, and it continues to grow and grow, and you're informing more and more young people about this work. I also think that digital organizing is a tool, but I like to think of it as digital to a next level. So it's not just like having people like Facebook posts and things like that, but say, for instance, if Lit runs a petition and says like, hey, sign up for this, and like you put your, to stay informed, give us your cell phone number, right? Then someone from the Lit team will follow up and call them and say like, hey, I see you signed this petition. You really care about this issue. Let's talk about this. And every time that issue comes up or there's something happening around it or Lit's doing an activation around it, they call them and let them know that this is an important issue right now. And here's what's going on about it. And will you participate? And like, here's how. So it's like this level of taking it from digital to in-person or in-person virtually, whatever that looks like right now. So I think those are three big things. So community organizing, relational organizing, and digital organizing.
Thanks so much, Don. Dr. Hanmer, you mentioned something at the very beginning about you're hoping that states can communicate more with a broader group of people. And I'm wondering, what are the things that you would suggest based on all your research experience focusing on young voters to really reach some young people who, maybe first-time voters, or maybe, they haven't voted in a while, right? Or they haven't understood the system and how to do that. I mean, what recommendations would you have for, states in doing that process over the next few weeks?
Sure. So I think some of the best things they can do are to put out information on their websites, put out information through their social media to explain the process, make it clear that it's really not that hard, and that they're there to provide assistance. I think also, speaking about college students in particular, I think it's really important, given some of the confusion that we see about what college students can and can't do regarding where they're going to register. And that's a place where I think they can do a lot of good explaining that college students who have a hometown and a college town can choose. And they just need to figure out how to establish, residency, which they almost surely have done if they've been to campus, and then follow the process. It's crucial, I think, that they also inform local election officials when it relates to college students, because it can get confusing. We have places where the dorms are closed and someone might want to register at their previous dorm address, and they have every right to do that, but that might not be obvious to everybody. And so getting that information out, not just to the individual young people that might be interested in registering and voting, but also to provide clarity so that the local officials don't make mistakes.
Okay, we're getting some amazing questions in, including some questions about disaggregated data. And Justin, I'm wondering if you can speak to, we're talking about the diversity of young generations, diverse in so many ways. We have a question here about disabled young voters. And I'm wondering, to what extent in the, this first glance at the data that y'all have, can you speak to, what different groups of young people are thinking?
Yeah, so to kind of give a little bit of insight about what we do with our data. So we get our data set back, and we actually we use that, and we actually kind of slice it up by different demographic groups. So let's take race. We might look at the data in terms of how young white voters are thinking, how young Black voters are thinking, and how young Hispanic voters are thinking, and we actually see very different patterns. So just to talk about the gap that exists between white voters and Black voters and Hispanic voters, we actually see that white voters are a lot more likely, or our white respondents were a lot more likely to say that they were registered to vote or that they planned on voting. In contrast, young Black Americans reported that they were likely to vote or registered to vote 10 points behind young white Americans, and young Hispanic Americans 10 points behind that. So there's a huge racial gap there between the likelihood to vote of young white Americans and the likelihood to vote of young Hispanic Americans, especially. We also see, with regards to gender, a lot of our data supports what Circle has found, with young women really driving this turnout, this activism. We also see that in our data. Young women are more likely to vote for Joe Biden. Young women are more likely to be registered. Young women are more likely to want to vote. They're more likely to support peaceful protests. We definitely see a lot of that in our data. Something that is interesting, however, is when we look at the horse race, when we look at the presidential race by race, we actually see that Biden and Trump are more or less tied when it comes to young white Americans. Most of that movement that is giving kind of Joe Biden this huge lead, and this is truly a huge lead that we haven't seen before, really, in our history, is coming from young Black voters and coming from young Hispanic voters. They are really this engine that is driving the Biden machine right now with young voters.
Thanks so much, Justin. So, y'all, we're getting some amazing questions in, and there's two here that I wanna start with. And feel free to jump in. I'm gonna read two of them. Feel free to jump in on either one. The first is, what are the issues related to young voters that are underreported in the media? And the second is, what do you think is the greatest misconception about the youth vote?
I could start with the first question. These are two great questions, and there's so much to talk about. I think issues that are not being talked about enough are actually, we do focus on the economy. We do talk about the pandemic, but young voters also care about how we talk about racial issues. There's for the past few debates, we've done focus groups with college students from across the country, and at every debate, all of our respondents are quite concerned with how we talk about race. They don't think the way that we talk about race in our country today has enough nuance and is sensitive enough to the reality of what the impact that these issues have on our country today. So race is definitely one of those issues that I think we might hear in the media, but isn't discussed in the way that young people want it to be discussed. Another big issue that really isn't talked about in the media, but really should be, is the mental health of young Americans. This is another sneak peek into our data coming out later this month. But young Americans we are the anxious generation. We are anxious about our future. We are anxious about elections and policies. We're anxious about gun violence in schools. We're anxious about finding jobs. And this trickles down into how we vote and how we view politics today. Yet when we turn on the TV, when we turn on CNN or CBS, we don't really hear about what the government is doing to help us gain access to mental health services, or how we or normalizing talk of mental health in our society in general. So I would say those two issues are examples of what isn't being talked about enough today.
Justin, I was resonating with that anxious generation. I was like, yes, talk about it. That's so real. I think the second question was around a misconception around the youth vote. Is that right? I think the big one that often pops up is that young people are apathetic. And I really hate hearing that, because if you actually look at what Dakota was talking about, like if you go back to folks taken to the streets to hold folks accountable for the racial injustices that we're seeing, it's definitely led by young people. I think this goes back to us specifically thinking about youth engagement on the level of only voting, which I know that is one benchmark that we can look at, but it doesn't tell the whole story, right? So I think related to that too, that's buried underneath that, is Dakota's point as well about the lack of civic education now that is being provided at schools. And so now organizations are having to take that on to help folks see that voting is one tool in their toolbox to getting to this reform and all the other things that they would like to see. And then I also think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is the lack of investment in young people. And so if you're not actually investing and also informing young people about how you're going to make an impact in their day-to-day lives, it's a lot harder for them to see you vote for a particular candidate or turn out for a candidate that isn't talking about the issues that they care about and actually talking about meaningful change. So I don't think it's apathy. I think it's that there are a lot of other factors that play into that, whether it be civic education, whether it be a lack of information, and all these other things.
I think just to add to those 2 points is, I think often what isn't recognized in the media and when we talk about the youth vote is there's really, maybe 2.5 generations when we categorize the youth vote, right? We have, a little bit older youth like Dawn who are in the millennial stage, and you got Gen Z, right? So, and really, when you look at the characteristics of how they move politically, there's almost 2 different ideologies there as well too. And I think that's often ignored, is it get bundles up into the youth vote. And sometimes I hear, that the term millennial and Gen Z, no one really understands, they think that 18-year-olds are millennials, and that's not the case, right? Like Dawn is not the same as an 18-year-old. Dawn has some gray hairs, right? And so we have to recognize and value that wisdom that Dawn has aged with. And so I think that's often missed in the narrative that, the people that we're working with at Lit primarily are Gen Zs, right? And so it's a lot different than your youngest millennials in terms of what we're striving for politically as well too. And I think that is often ignored and just bundled together.
Dr. Hanwer, any misconceptions or that you see about young people, either in the media or in conversations that you hear?
Sure. So I just want to, second what Donna, Dakota have already said, and really just focus on the investment side. If you invest in young people, they'll show up. If you ask them to vote, they'll show up. They'll do these things. I think that is widely misunderstood by the campaigns, especially. And this go after the base strategy has really dominated a lot of the mobilization across time. I think we've seen that eroding as more and more money has come into politics. But still, I think there's too much emphasis by the parties and the campaigns on contacting the base supporters multiple times and not enough on trying to grow. And young people is where I think they could do the most along those lines.
I love it. Let's grow voters, y'all. Okay, so we just mentioned kind of the base, so we got to get into the horse race a little bit. And so we have a question about how are young people impacting the election and how are young people showing up in swing states? So anyone want to speak to what they're seeing, what they're hearing from data or on the ground in, maybe other than Wisconsin, but Dakota, if you want to give some more examples, that's amazing too, about what's happening in these states where we saw such small margins in 2016.
I can touch on, I will say that we did some polling that is definitely on our C4 side. So I will name that, that shows young persuadable voters in swing states are very enthusiastic about voting, right? So that is one thing that was really exciting to see, is that they're very enthusiastic. We also particularly talked about, asked them about how they're planning to vote. And it was interesting to see that even in places where they have the opportunity to vote by mail, a lot of young Black and Brown youth in particular are still very much planning to vote in person. So I think folks are enthusiastic about voting. They've identified the way in which they're planning to vote. And then the added nuance to that is that they're also planning to vote early, so which is also exciting. So I think in places where folks are able to take advantage of voting early, a lot of the young people that are planning to vote in person are planning to vote early. Yeah, I'll leave it at that and see if there are other questions that arise from that info.
I can say a little bit in general about college students. So in that study I referenced from 2004, one of the really interesting things we found was a suggestion that college students were very strategic. So if they were from a state that was not a battleground and they were going to college in a state that is a battleground, they were much more likely to switch their registration and try to vote in that state. There's a recent paper that should be out now that uses actually the great NSOLVE data to provide an even stronger test of that, because it's really just an incredible data source. And it just strongly supports this view that students are paying attention to those strategic dynamics, and they are registering in places where it's more competitive.
Thanks so much, Dr. Hanmer. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, NSOLVE is a study run out of the Tisch College of Civic Life by my amazing colleagues there. And it is an amazing data set. So speaking of college, we also received a question about the fact that some college campuses are doing stuff online, right? Some of the classes are online, partially or entirely. And so many first years may not be able to register doing that site-based registration, and wondering, given what you just said, Dr. Hanmer and others, what do you think are the effects of this pandemic kind of situation on college student registration and turnout?
So another thing I think we learned from some of the survey work we've done is, the majority of students really tend to prefer to register in their hometown. But we do see a significant number still interested in registering in their college town. And that's just a lot harder when you don't have the same in-person contact. The great efforts that we've seen from some campuses to make registration part of orientation, just can't do that as well, I don't think, in an online environment. And so I haven't seen the hard data on this, but I do think that that's a serious concern. But one of the great things that I think has been going on is the student groups have really been active, and they knew this was coming, they planned for it, and they're doing something about it. So they weren't caught off guard, and I think they were in the field trying to do everything they can. I can certainly say that, for the coalition on my campus, they anticipated and planned for all scenarios and came up with what I think is a really remarkable plan. And so I'm confident that we'll do well. And I hope that's the case across the board.
Yeah, I think some of our experience in Wisconsin around this is teaching the students how to organize and how to convince their professor to give them control over the Zoom classroom and do a classroom presentation on how to register to vote through the state website or one of the apps that we're using. So I think while it's been difficult, and I think in some aspects it's also been a little bit easier since you have control of the screen and like what else are people going to be looking at, right? And so in some aspects it is definitely harder to not be able to talk to as many people like in person, but I think still being able to adjust digitally, while it's been a challenge, it's still been pretty successful in terms of doing classroom wraps, figuring out like, how to get it down in a certain amount of time, figuring out, the screen share thing and walking people through it. I think it's still pretty successful, and young people are always going to innovate, right? Like you tell young people no, they're going to find another way to do it. And so I think it's just been a challenge, but still being done in terms of registering folks who are virtual, as well as many groups like Lit and a part of the Alliance Network are calling them, texting them, and they're getting mail from us, as well as some of us are doing some cool influencer campaigns and trying to get people that they follow on Instagram to talk about registering to vote as well too. So while we miss them in person, they're definitely going to hear from us one way or the other.
Thanks, Dakota. So we have a little bit longer. Folks, keep sending in your questions. There's this pretty amazing question that I want to bring up because it reminds me of what Dakota said a little bit earlier in the conversation, that this is a moment that will determine their lives. And so one of our participants has asked, how do we keep youth engaged beyond 2020? It seems like the things that matter to the youth vote deviate from things that matter to those currently in power. How can we stop people from becoming disenfranchised? I'm assuming after the election. So how would y'all answer that question?
I can take a shot at that. So I don't think, I'm not anticipating youth to be disinterested in the political process or disengaged at all. I think what we're going to see is a greater influx, right? Regardless of how this election goes, young people are going to have demands, and they're going to take to the streets to make sure that what's that happens, right? It's either holding somebody accountable to the promises that they make or pushing somebody not to do cruel things. So I wouldn't say that we're going to see young people back off. I think they're going to step up and really own and push for that 100-day agenda to be theirs across the country, more so than anything. Young people are not, I don't think young people are waking up and being like, you know what, on November 3rd, if I vote, I'm going to save my community, right? Like, I think they know November 4th, they're going to have to get to work, November 5th, and so on and so on. And that really, I think what this country has seen is going to awaken is, particularly with the Gen Zs, is going to create probably the most civically engaged generation of their lifetime when it's all said and done. And not just in terms of voting, but protesting and really just like taking over what it means to be civically involved, and reimagining what this country can do for people.
I just want to co-sign what Dakota said. I think that is like the beauty of the network that we're a part of, is that we're around past election day. We don't go away once election day happens and disappear. I think it is this continued sustained engagement that our folks are constantly doing. So like after the election, that then starts the plan for what our legislative plan is locally, as well as what this looks like as far as accountability to the legislators that just went into office as a result of the election that just happened on November 3rd. So the work doesn't stop. We're constantly organizing, and like election day and voting is just like, again, one tool in the toolbox, but there's so much more that goes into that. And our groups are really good about sustained engagement and making sure that young people don't just become disinterested or fall off or whatever. We keep them engaged and make sure that they are staying up to date on the issues that they care most about.
Yeah, I think Dakota and Dawn are 1000% correct with this. I mean, everything they've said is, I think, really how we can keep that engagement going on. Tie in some polling like that we've found into this. There's a big question with like why is Biden polling so well, yet his enthusiasm so low with young voters? And I think that's a sign that like there are a lot of young voters who are excited about voting for change, who don't necessarily see Biden as the destination. They see him as kind of the vehicle to bring them to a better future, and the future that they want to see. And I think that's a sign that things aren't going to slow down after, if Biden wins the election. If Trump wins the election, then I think we'll see even more youth activism and more youth engagement. But I think there's this worry that young people aren't going to be engaged if Joe Biden wins, and that will revert back to the Obama years. But I truly think that young people are intent on keeping their elected officials accountable from now on, and they're intent on having a piece of that, as Dakota put it, 100-day agenda. They want to make it theirs. And if politicians who are depending on the youth vote, and there are most of I do think most politicians depend on the youth vote. If those politicians want to stay in power, they need to listen to their young voters, and they need to keep them engaged so that they turn out for the next time as well.
Thank you all so much. We've covered a lot of territory. There's a ton more questions that we haven't covered that are wonderful, including a really great question about TikTok. And I know a couple of y'all have mentioned TikTok, but we've run out of time. I want to thank all of the folks who put time into this: Sarah, James, Tova, the Ash Center. Thank you, Mike, Justin, Don, Dakota, for the conversation. And just a reminder that everything that Justin talked about is on the IOP website. He put the link into the chat. And as you've been seeing, the recording for this will be online on YouTube. You can hear more about what these amazing panelists and experts have had to say. And thank you all so much. And as our panelists have said, I just want to close this out by saying this is a long road and a broad road to be engaging young people. It's about the next 3 weeks and so much more for the next election cycle. And as Dakota said, for a lot of people's lives. So thank you all so much for participating, and we will talk to you.